welcome to the Q&A session. You know how I've been asking all of you to post questions on Discuss, and well, there's a reason for that. See, today with us is Alex, Andrea, Jens, Robert, Sam, and Manish. Yen will join later, and so let me explain to you how this will work. So we've collected the questions for our panelists, and I'll be asking them in turn. So I'll be going, Robert, so-and-so, the questions, and then panelists feel free to butt in with answers or follow-up questions if you have them. Cool. And I think we're live with the questions, right? So let's, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Right. So let's start with a question that's open to all. Anyone can pick up this question to answer. So if I'm brand new to GraphQL, what should I do next to get my head wrapped around this space? We'll start with let's see, Alex starts first. Go.
Oh dear. I don't know. I learned by doing stuff. So my first thing is just finding some docs or a tutorial and start walking through and just doing it over and over and over until I learn something eventually.
Andrea?
Yeah, so what was really helpful for me was I used a resource called How to GraphQL. And what I loved about it is there was text, there was also a video, and then there was a knowledge quiz. And then building a project is the best way to learn. For me, I learn by doing. So think about something you want to do with GraphQL and start it and figure out resources as you go. It's a really great community. You could always ask questions on Stack Overflow or Slack groups, but the best way to get started is just think of something you want to learn in GraphQL and a project that you want to do. And just keep it simple. Don't try to learn everything.
All right, Jens?
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I would just go to graphql.org. I think they have very good documentation on all the concepts, what you need to understand. And that's a very good starting point, I think.
Okay, Manish?
I'll give you an example of what not to do to get started with GraphQL, because like remember we started in 2015. So we started with the GraphQL spec. It's a long detailed document with a lot of intricate, interesting details. And we started there, and it takes a while to like wrap your head around it. Thankfully, today there's a lot more resources available on the internet to get you started, get you building an app really fast, and really applying GraphQL instead of like learning the GraphQL spec. But I do want to ask you, Chu, because you recently learned GraphQL yourself. Like, yeah. What do you think some of the resources are?
So I agree with Jens that having the spec actually helps a lot because different people think in different ways. I think in BNF. If you give me a BNF, I'll understand a lot faster compared to say most people. So yeah. I say have a spec, and the BNF is gigantic, by the way. Yeah, so let's pass this question on to Robert. And yeah, Robert.
Yeah, I don't know how to improve the answer that all the fine folks gave. It's pretty hard being last here. Come on.
Oh, Sam's not answered yet. So.
Yeah, I do think that there's two ways to interpret the question. How do you get started with GraphQL? One is how do you get started with GraphQL as somebody who is building an application with GraphQL, right? And you can subdivide that into how do you get started consuming a GraphQL API, and that might be for those of you who are front-end engineers. And another concept might be how do you build a GraphQL server for your front-end engineers if you're a back-end engineer? And a third variation on that might even be, how do I get my team to start using GraphQL? I know what it is, but how do I get my organization to adopt it? And then a fourth one, which is the least common, but in my opinion, one of the most interesting ways to ask this question is how do you get started by contributing to the GraphQL community, contributing to all the really exciting projects that we have. And I want to answer the last one first, because I didn't hear any questions about that. I have a great answer for this. Right. We have GraphQL working group. The working group is the body of people who comes together and it helps push the various GraphQL projects forward. It's very interesting. It's very open, lots of smart and passionate folks, and it's open membership. If you want to find the GraphQL working group schedule, just check out the GraphQL repo on GitHub. It's under agendas, sign yourself up, and you're in. And it's very accessible. I don't know of another open source project that has this level of visibility while maintaining this level of openness and low barrier to participation. So the other three, I think, are all interesting topics that I would like to hear from other people. But definitely in terms of joining the GraphQL community, being a contributing member, check out the repo.
Cool. Sam, any thoughts?
Everybody basically answered it. The only thing I didn't hear that has helped me in the past has been to try to rebuild something that was in REST that I had and do that in GraphQL. So that would mostly be on the back end, but you could also experiment with that on the front end. Try to take a project that you have that's using a REST API and turn it into a GraphQL project. That has helped me a lot with just translating between, like, getting the mental model down between REST and GraphQL.
Right. Yep. Yep. All right. So now we're going to go into individual questions. We'll start with Manish. We'll do it in the order of the talks of the day. So Manish, we'll start with you. Credits are based on queries. What about layered queries? This is, of course, talking about /GraphQL. I may return 10 filtered records from a subquery that hits 100,000 records. What's the cost there?
Yes, so if you actually behind the scenes access 100,000 records, and that's actually typically what happens with graph queries. They can look very simple, but they can traverse to a lot of like records in the behind the scenes, do filtering, do joins, and so on and so forth, and then finally only return 10 results. In that case, I think we are still considering the query cost, the cost of running a query, and that would consider all the records that we had to retrieve in the back to be able to run this query. And so the query credit, the cost of the query would be proportional to that. And again, remember, this is actually using a logarithm. This is using a logarithm of the number of records accessed. So, 10,000 records is like 3 credits and 100,000 is 4 credits and so on and so forth.
Okay, makes sense. I see we're joined by Yan. Hello.
Hey guys.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're going to go around by speakers, and I'll be asking individual questions to each of you. But if you have any answers that are good, you can just jump in and answer after the person who's targeted. So, right, now question is now for Robert. Is it good practice to make GraphQL proxy servers over REST API providers just to hide the REST endpoint, or is that a waste of resources in case I don't want to expose my REST endpoints to the front end?
Okay, let me see if I understand this. When you say proxy, you mean leaving your REST API in place and then putting GraphQL on top of REST.
That is correct.
And then is the REST API also still in production and serving requests at the same time? That's the question, right? In case I don't want to expose my REST endpoints to the front end. So maybe not.
So I think the REST endpoints are still in production and they're just trying to hide it.
Okay, yeah, and I guess the decision to hide it can be kind of a pretty easy switch where you just switch over to a different path that expects GraphQL requests exclusively. Yeah, I think it's a good way to get started. Going back to Sam's point, it's a way to ease yourself in, and anything that makes you or your organization more comfortable in terms of getting your hands on with GraphQL goes a long way, because like everyone said, I think just about everybody who answered that first question mentioned that it's how important it is to go hands-on, to have the thing in front of you, to know how it works, how it breaks, what the limitations are. And if that gets you there, then that's the path. And I would even go one step further. I think some people, when they talk about REST and GraphQL, they seem to set these two technologies up as a dichotomy, like you got to have one or the other. And let's think about this for a second. That's impossible. You'll never have a pure GraphQL API, or almost never, because if you're dealing with anything like HTTP, something is going to transfer some resource, like an image or a binary or whatever, and it doesn't really fit in the GraphQL model anymore, right? And this is exactly how the Facebook GraphQL API works. If you fetch, profile picture for a user or your friend's profile pictures, you get a URL. What are you going to do with that URL? That's not GraphQL. That's HTTP, or that's just, a resource-based HTTP. So I think the reality is that REST is never going to go away, and that's not a bad thing. Like REST is a powerful architecture. It has a whole host of benefits that GraphQL will frankly never match, and it shouldn't. Like GraphQL is a tool; it solves a specific set of problems, and when you use the two in conjunction, you can get a lot of benefits. So I wouldn't necessarily even see it as, oh, look, this REST API is a legacy, and we somehow need to modernize and move up to the GraphQL API. It's more like, what exactly was there a performance problem? Was there an overfetching issue? Do you need subscriptions for reduced latency? And once you have those use cases in mind about why exactly you're using GraphQL, then okay, you have reasons to move.
Okay, that makes sense. So anyone wants to jump in on that? No?
Yeah, I guess maybe I can add something as well, because GraphQL is great for a lot of front-end focused teams. You can get you access to a lot of data in having the backend really easy and really quickly. But for a lot of backend processes that talk to each other, you really don't need GraphQL. REST is really easy, really good to do as well. So like Robert said, it's not going anywhere. They each have a really good use case, but they can be used and complement each other quite nicely.
Or to put it as Jens said, it's not a religion. Right. So the next question is for Andrea. Do you still overfetch data from your database, or do you have some dynamic way of generating what fields to query the database?
Can you say that one more time?
Yep. So do you overfetch data from the database, or do you have some sort of a dynamic way of generating what fields to query the database with?
Yeah, so we do have some overfetching. I think GraphQL abstracting over REST APIs is perfectly normal, just as it would be to abstract over multiple database calls. But yes, we do overfetch a bit. We use data loader and field resolvers, and that's still an open issue that we're working on. But for the most part, we are getting the data that we need, but it still does happen.
So you're not using like a dynamic generator for your queries?
Not yet.
Cool. All right, the next question's for Alex. So does Gatsby pull the entire data set from your GraphQL endpoint or on every deploy? And if that's the case, wouldn't that just get really slow for large sites?
Yeah, so there's a couple answers to that question depending on what kind of build we're talking about. So if we're talking about no cache, cold build, it's going to fetch all the data you've requested it to build. In that demo specifically, I filtered down just to films and actually filtered down to 100 films because the GraphQL or the dgraph team who loaded that database was very kind and gave me a couple million nodes to work with. But I wasn't about to download those all into Gatsby. So that's the scale Gatsby's not even ready for. I think we're working on like the 10,000+ node level right now and continually looking to improve that. But yeah, so it can be an issue, but that should be just the initial build time. Once you have that cache in place and you're doing warm builds, a good source plugin, which is part of what the GraphQL toolkit that we are releasing is helping with, is that source plugin should only be fetching the changes now. And that can be done in a couple different ways, but basically it should be able to reach out to the database or whatever and say, hey, what's new since the last time I built? It received those updated nodes and it just has to change those. The demo I had doesn't really do that yet, though with the future JavaScript functionality of /QL that Manish talked about, that is something that would be much more possible, because then every time I write a certain type, I could add basically some kind of change log in another type that says, hey, this node with this ID over here updated. And then I just need a timestamp cached on my Gatsby build that says, hey, this is the last time I built, and it just pulls all the latest from that data type. And the final one, which is what I demoed at the end, was incremental builds. And again, I kind of hacked that one together, but basically I passed the ID of the updated node for the film into Gatsby, and the toolkit just handled saying, oh, I know how to fetch just that node. It fetched just that piece of node, updated just that page, and rebuilt the site and redeployed it. So initially you have to fetch everything, but if the plugin is built correctly, it doesn't have to rebuild on every fetch or refetch on every build.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and you did show off the incremental build. Okay, yep. Thank you. So the next question, moving on really quickly, sorry, we've got time to keep. Moving on really quite quickly, it's for Sam. So in the case where granular permissions are required instead of roles, what would you recommend for authorization? And follow-up questions to these would be like wouldn't storing the entire permissions in a JWT be a terrible idea because it's going to be quite huge in this case, right? So yes, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, there's different ways that you can store permissions. Sometimes it makes more sense to store permissions in the database and pull those when you grab the user and then do it that way instead of storing the permissions in the JWT itself. So you can be flexible on that. It's also, yeah, I saw in the question on the Discord about changing the token to reflect the updates and things like that. If that's another issue that you come across, that might be another good reason to store your roles or permissions separately in a database. And then when the user is authenticated and they log in, then you can go pull those permissions based on the user ID. As far as granular permissions instead of roles, it really kind of just depends on what you're trying to do. If you need like access on the field level or the object level or things like that, but all of those are valid use cases. So it's kind of hard to answer without knowing a little bit more specifically what the situation is. But
specific use cases, yeah, okay. Now that makes sense. And our next question is for Yan about Appsync. So how does Appsync figure out what to cache?
Appsync doesn't. You configure it. So for Appsync, you can cache your entire request, and that's kind of the default behavior. But you can also tune it so that you can decide which of the resolver you actually want to enable caching on. You can also do that by saying, okay, for this request, I can cache. I want to take the user ID as make it part of the cache key. I want to also include maybe the user's identity username, so that those becomes a unique data points that gets cached. Or maybe if I'm doing a nested resolver, maybe I want to cache the university a student belongs to. Everyone from the university is going to be querying the same data. It doesn't make sense for you to fetch the same data from the university table every single time. So I'm just going to cache by the university's own ID. So you have a lot of control over which piece of data gets cached with Appsync. And I guess all you have to configure in that case is just what goes into the cache key.
Cool, that's good to know. And so Fsync is only AWS. Have you seen something like that from GCP or Azure?
Not yet, but I don't use those. I don't use the GCP or Azure as much.
Fair enough, you're an AWS hero, so.
Well, yes, there's enough coming out of AWS that keeps me busy, so I don't have enough time to try everything. But as far as I know, they don't have a GraphQL as a service on those platforms, at least yet.
All right. So
Go
the
AWS.
next, sorry?
Go AWS.
So the next question is for Jens. It's about best practices on when or when not to use persistent queries. See, on the one hand, you've got like the benefits of caching, but on the other hand, the flexibility of GraphQL, allows the users to send queries without overfetching, and those things are not predefined upfront. So Jens?
I would actually rephrase that question to what happens when you don't use persistent queries, because when you start up using GraphQL, you feel like, okay, in the client, I can write my query, I get all the data I want, no under overfetching, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe there's some sensitive data and you haven't really thought about how a user could traverse your schema, or how could they get from one field to another that they should actually not see. So there's a lot of complexity because it's a graph and you can traverse. There's a lot of problems with that. And so before deploying your GraphQL server to production, if you don't have the knowledge to make a GraphQL deployment really secure, you actually shouldn't be doing it. And you need an expert to do that, who knows all the problems that can occur. And for some problems, persistent queries are a solution. I'm not saying you must use persistent queries, but for some, they are a very good solution because, for example, what we do at WonderGraph is you persist the query, you attach, for example, a required scope, and that simply means you only can do that with the scope, and that's it. So by that, we're eliminating a lot of security problems. There might be other solutions. I'm not saying this is the only way to do that. It's more like, yeah, if you want to use GraphQL in production, be sure that you understand all the problems that it brings with it.
Cool.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick note on the power of persistent queries. This is really something that helps out a lot in production because it helps you identify that query. So for instance, without a persistent query, you would have no way to know which clients are sending what queries, right? And so, for example, I'll go back to Facebook again because I think it's just the largest scale GraphQL server out there. What we had at Facebook was a database of all of the persistent queries that were ever written. And we know which version of which client application sends that query. So for instance, we might have a persistent query hashed to, ABC123. We know this comes from iOS version, 212 or something. And we also know what that hashed text resolves into as far as the GraphQL document goes. And so if you introduce an API breaking change, well, think about the tooling that we can do. Now we can say something like, okay, if you remove this field, or if you retype this field from an int to a bool, it will affect the following set of persistent queries, which will affect the following set of client versions. And then you can then make a decision like, is that okay, right? Maybe the version that you affected is from 5 years ago. And if you look at the graph of the number of users sending these requests in, it's down to a trickle of maybe a couple dozen. So you can make that kind of judgment call, but that would not be possible without persistent queries. So really, really insightful here. Persistent queries, very often overlooked, and it would solve a lot of problems, not least of which is security, bounded complexity, but also just in terms of end-to-end tooling.
Actually, on that note, can I ask a follow-up question there? So I think does Facebook also manage two different versions of the same GraphQL schema with like slight variations, where something could be string in one version of GraphQL schema and could be bool in the other version, to maintain backwards compatibility with the older clients?
No, not as far as I know. I mean, maybe it's changed, but there's no notion of versioning that GraphQL schema. I mean, I'm talking about the Facebook universe. So there were 4 GraphQL universes at Facebook. What the other ones did, I'm not 100% sure, but the main one, the big one, that had no notion of versioning.
I wanted to add one more thing to that, because I really like the example. So you usually have the problem with native apps that you deploy them, you go through the Apple App Store process, it takes some time. You cannot change the app when it's out there because people have like super old versions of your app. You cannot change it, but the query is there. And with persistent queries, it's not just that there's a client with that old query. You could actually, because it's persisted on the server, you could actually add a middleware that makes this client still compatible to the breaking change. You see?
Absolutely.
That's a pretty good way to think about it. And I think in our talks today, Sean Grove also echoed a very similar point of view. So That's very interesting. Okay, our next question is open, and we're going to go the opposite direction. So we're going to start with Sam, right? And this question is quite a mouthful. So and we'll start with Sam because Sam is pretty much the guy who talked a lot about directives. So with the implementation of directives left to the discretion at the server framework provider, the people who are actually implementing the server, what happens is we'll end up with a landscape full of very deeply fragmented frameworks to the point where we don't even have a standard way to handle dates. What gives? How would you tackle this problem? And would a new GraphQL standard help with this thing?
I personally think that is a problem that can come up. You might try having a shared date directive inside of your organization. I'm not sure. There are other people here who have a lot more sway on the spec and things like that as far as prescribing something like this in the spec, but it seems like this would be something that you'd want to do internally as an organization and have a standardized date directive that you use throughout your organization and not try to solve it for the world at large, just since dates are so frustrating and complicated due to time zone issues and things like that. But I'd definitely be curious to hear what any of the other panelists would have to say about it as well.
Yen? Any thoughts on that?
Yen or Jens?
Yen.
For me? Okay. Don't have anything to add.
Okay, Robert.
Maybe Jens does.
Yeah, dates are the most commonly requested custom scalar, and the way we've gone in so many circles around datetime custom scalars in the spec. It's got a really interesting history, and it's well worth following. But customs. So one of the approaches. Let me back up. I don't want to assume any prior knowledge here, but the problem here is that GraphQL doesn't have a very rich type system. There are 7 built-in scalars, and in a lot of languages, a date is a scalar itself, right? Or at least it's embedded type that is available to every implementation of like JavaScript,
Yep.
for example, just has a notion of a date somewhere.
Mm.
Same thing with .NET. Same thing with a lot of. I don't need to give any more examples, but the problem is how do you like Sam was saying, how its date time is super frustrating. There's like at least 4 different major specifications out there, each with sometimes conflicting or contradicting representations of date and time zones and standardizations. So what do you do? Well, in GraphQL, we have the ability to create something called a custom scalar.
Yeah.
And this is like, you might create a custom scalar for a simple data structure that, remember, scalars as opposed to object types are fields in GraphQL where you can no longer select into. So you can think of them as dead ends in the graph, right? They're leaves. And the ability to create custom scalars has been around for a long time. So you can always go in there and you can create a custom scalar like, lat long, let's say, right? But with datetime, you have to be a little bit more careful because what is the format that you're using? If you choose something like Unix epic, you should have the ability to say that this is not just a number, this is a Unix epic.
Yeah.
Or let's say that you're using ISO 8601 and you use a certain extension to ISO 8601. You should be able to say, this is the encoding format for this datetime. And now, to be 100% clear, GraphQL will never solve this mechanism will never solve the problem of unifying everybody in the world under one interchangeable datetime format. Nobody will solve that problem. But what it will solve is it will have the ability to say, not only is this a custom scalar, but this custom scalar is to be encoded and decoded in accordance with the following specification or set of specifications. Right? So you could say something like custom scalar, and then the specification is ISO 8601 plus extension B. And then what that will do, hopefully, is in the tooling, you can parse that and you can say, okay, I got it. Now, if I'm building an iOS application, the package that I pull in needs to be compatible with ISO 8601 and extension B. I'm making this up. I don't know if there's a library like that. but hopefully that gets the point across, right? It's not just the ability to express custom scalars. That's always been there. It's the ability to express the specification behind the custom scalar within the GraphQL schema.
Okay, fair.
I just want to ask a follow-up on that to understand this. So Rob, what you're saying is you want to change the GraphQL schema so that when the client downloads the schema, they can actually understand how to encode and decode a scalar.
Yes.
Okay, I see.
Not me. I cannot take any credit for this work. This is all stuff that's happening in the working group.
Okay.
Manish, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of thoughts on on that because we in the fork of GraphQL that we maintain, GraphQL plus minus, we sort of like added datetime, we added geo, we added even a password type so that if you set the password type, then it automatically encrypts it and you can never like get the original back. And we made it really secure. And date is hard. It's a lot harder than people imagine it is. And so I think like to Robert's point about how do you deal with all these different like formats. I was just actually while Robert was talking, I was looking at like the Go time package, right? And it has like a long list of formats that you can parse, and one of them is RFC 3339. Right? Obviously, Epoch is another one, and there is even a kitchen format, which is like this. It just contains a time with like an AM or PM and nothing else, right? And we have the hard job. And remember, dgraph has a flexible schema, so we actually have a hard job of trying to determine, does it look like a date, right? So we actually like go through steps where we will first try to see if we can parse it as an epoch. Then we'll try to see if we can parse it as a kitchen timer. Then we'll try to see if we can parse it as an RFC 3339. Then we'll try to see if we can parse it as something else. So we kind of like go through like 4 or 5 different parsers just to see, hey, does this look like a valid date to us? And then when we return back, that there's another problem, because just between Go and JavaScript, they cannot agree upon exactly what the formatting should be. The way JavaScript uses the date is different from the way Go uses the date. So we actually like have to convert it back into something that most languages would be able to parse when you ask for it back. So you can in dgraph you can give it as an epoch, but then get it back as a JavaScript understandable sort of date format. And actually, I don't know if you saw the tweets live today, but the script that I have is sending it from Twitter datetime format, which is like epochish, into dgraph, and then back as like a properly formatted string. So that is, that is tricky. And then if you think about geo, that's even like kind of weirder, because you have polygons and you have lines and you have like multi-polygons and so on and so forth. And password is something that we created, right? Like there's nothing like that exists. So that's the question that we always have around GraphQL spec. How much should GraphQL spec prescribe, and how much should the different implementations of GraphQL server add on, right? Like if you look at GraphQL plus minus, it has so many things. It has things like variables, just like SQL has variables. Should GraphQL spec also have variables? Probably not, because most users of GraphQL, like most implementers of GraphQL spec, it would be too hard for them to implement those things, and maybe they don't even need those things. So GraphQL spec,
Turing complete,
right? And so GraphQL spec actually, the way I see it is that it has to be a subset of the functionality that everybody needs, and everybody agrees that yes, they want to implement it, right? And I think at this point, looks like datetime is something that everybody sort of generally agrees that it would be good to have. But do they agree that geo would be good to have? I don't know. It remains to be seen. So I think it's really about, it's almost like it seems to me from an outsider, it's almost like a democratic building, right? It's like when enough people say that they want something, then it becomes useful to have. Until then, you can kind of add on all of these interesting types, which would be useful to your users and probably would not be useful to, let's say, Facebook or an Airbnb or something.
So based on that description, do you think that the custom scalar specification feature, as I described it, would be useful for you?
I actually need to look a bit more carefully into that. So we actually have been, I think in the /GraphQL, we actually have datetime as a special type that we specify. And then you can use things as datetime. But I think a custom scaler there, just like directives, would be quite useful because then it'll become part of the spec. Probably not part of the spec, I'd say, but become part of the implementation.
Jens, anything else to add to this?
What was the question again?
The question's about fragmentation of the backend due to having the directives. So having a directive requires you to implement something in the backend by yourself. That leads to a fragmented backend. So what can we do to solve that? Robert and Manish and Yan has been talking about, and Sam has been talking about standardization process and focusing mainly on the datetime, but the question is much more open than that.
Yeah. So one directive that I see quite often when we talk about security is that people like to use auth directives in schemas. And this is, for me, it's kind of a pet peeve, because when I started using GraphQL, I first thought that tools like GraphQL Shield, for example, are really, really nice, because you can annotate your schema and then you have the auth rules applied. And the problem with that is, whenever something changes, you have to redeploy your server. That's super stupid, because I'm in production. I have a security leak. I need to redeploy my server for a security issue. That doesn't make sense for me. It needs to be a layer in front of that. So that was the moment when I stopped using those auth directives and tried to put something in front of my GraphQL server to do that. So this is one thing. And the second thing I'd like to share is the problem with directives is when you add custom directives and you annotate your schema, those directives they get thrown away when you run the introspection query. You cannot see them anymore. So you have that meta information and it's lost to the client. So even if you want to give some hints to the client what they can do or not with directives, that info is lost. So that's actually a problem, and that kind of holds you off from actually using that more.
Cool. I have some deep thoughts about that, but let's not get distracted by that. Andrea, what do you think of this fragmentation thing?
Yeah, so I wish I could be more helpful on this question, but we haven't run into this because internally we just convert everything to milliseconds since Unix epic, excuse me. So a datetime scaler would make this more expressive, but internally we just use epic, so it just hasn't come up yet. And we use milliseconds since epic because they're just really simple integers. So even if they aren't expressive, they're really easy to work with.
Cool. Well, simple solutions often trump things. Alex.
Actually, on that note, maybe I can add one more thing. That some interesting thing that we figured out about date times is that when we're doing indexing with date times and we're trying to index by hour or day, it's quite interesting on how you index. So initially we're parsing times in individual local time zones, and the same time in different time zones might have switched by an hour. And so you'll search for that string, and it would turn out that on that day this event didn't happen. But actually it did happen on that day if you were to look in terms of UTC. So then we learned to convert everything into UTC and then use it for indexing. And some of these interesting things, date is just such a poorly understood complex problem that I think you can write lots of articles about it and still miss out something about how
falsehoods programmers believe about date and time. There's actually an article called that.
I have a question for the group here. How much time do you think software engineers have collectively spent on time on this time?
I mean, Python's SF, the string passing, the string parsing of time is actually a website. There is actually a website for you to go pass in your format. So, yeah, plenty of programmer man hours have been wasted on date time.
I guess we should ask people who actually had to solve Y2K, right?
Yeah.
And it's still not solved. It's still going on.
It's 204. 204, it's coming. Alex, what do you think? What are your solutions?
Unlike most of these people, I spend most of my time on the front end, so I have never thought about this. I'm just enjoying listening and learning here. So I deal with dates, but not at the database level like y'all have. So.
All right, no problems. And now we're going back to individual questions, and we're reversing the order. So we're starting from Yan and going back up to Alex. And then we'll have one final round of quick fire questions. All right, so Yan, in your talk, you mentioned that the social network is backed by 2 separate Appsync APIs. Is there a reason to have 2, or could they have just been 1?
Mostly because the CMS is not meant to be used by end users. It's only meant to be used by the founders and also by the university admins. So they've got a very different authentication model. So, well, different community user pools altogether. Since there's no overlap, there's no reason why I have to lump them together. So it's just easier to have 2 rather than 1. But they talk to a lot of the same data sources, DB tables, Lambda functions, and whatnot. So there's a lot of sharing between the 2. So having the 2 of them inside the same project and having a monolithic deployment process makes a lot of that development, I guess, effort a lot simpler.
Cool. Thank you. And now Jens, is the method that you did, the compiled query where you stored an executable tree in a hash map, is that the best way to cache queries? And how would you compare that against other persistent query methods? Pros and cons. Go.
Pros and cons. It's simply the best method because it's just that because when you look, for example, at how the GraphQL JS implementation executes query, and once it gets super complicated and you want to extend the execution process, there's this ominous info object that gets passed along all the resolvers, and people try to figure out what is in there and how they can manipulate the execution of a query. And so when I started using that, I kind of came to a point where I was like, okay, the way GraphQL.js interprets queries, it could be correct, and it's the reference implementation, it's fine. But when I want to build something like, for example, a GraphQL proxy, it needs to be a lot more efficient. And so the way I build my engine, so to say, is I take the GraphQL query, I turn that into an AST, then I traverse the AST, and I have a configuration object that tells me, okay, if you want to have that field, you need to go to a database. If you want the other field, go to REST API. If you want to have that field, go to a GraphQL API. So I traverse the AST, I take all that information, and I have this kind of compiler, so to say, and then I build up a simple tree of functions. And I guess dgraph is written in Go, so you guys are familiar with that. Go is it's a memory based language. How do you say that? Garbage collected language. Sorry. So it's kind of a hard thing to optimize to run Go without garbage collection. But the thing is, when you have a query compiler, the compiler can be a bit slower because you persist the query, and the tree that you will finally execute that has 0 garbage collection. So it doesn't go anywhere on the heap, and it's just blazing fast. It's, I don't know, microseconds. And so from my point of view, there's nothing you could do to beat that.
Cool. Anyone wants to chime in?
I would say that I think when Jens said something about Go and garbage collector, my ears just kind of opened up, because it's, as a database, we have dealing with Go's memory. I almost feel like Go is like a memory monster, right? And you have to just continuously struggle with it to make sure that you won't go out of memory. But I completely hear you when you talk about Go and GC.
All right, next up, it's a question for Sam. It's quite long and quite complicated, so ears open. Most server-side authorization implementations I've seen actually involve checking the permissions from the JWT scopes at the start of each type resolving function. This means, for example, that a query may execute multiple database queries, like a GraphQL query will have to execute multiple database queries before reaching a nested resolver that fails a permission check. Is there any recommended way to verify all the permissions ahead of time to avoid this unnecessary computation?
So this came up in the chat as well with this person, and we talked a little bit about this. It's a really interesting problem to solve. We had talked about traversing the query AST to check permissions. One other way that you could probably solve some of this is to check some roles first to try to categorize your permissions in ways that would try to prevent maybe 60 or 80% of that happening. You know, if you can check for a role at the beginning in the context, and then, you know, gracefully handle the deeper query levels, you might save yourself a lot of engineering time of trying to like really go complicated with this. Otherwise, yeah, I think trying to do having some sort of middleware to traverse the query and gather up all of those different permissions needed might be a good way to do it. But again, this seems to me kind of like a smell of maybe maybe your permissions are a little too granular at that point, or maybe you need to kind of cluster them together or control the way the user is trying to reach that data. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so you think this is a code smell then?
It can be. I mean, there's probably a valid use case for it, but it may be before trying to do the complicated, you know, AST traversal thing. There might be some low-hanging fruit of just saying like, okay, when, like, look at the data and figure out like, okay, when does this actually happen? Like, when do these fail? And is there a way, you know, are they failing in a way that maybe that's a sign that we need to create a new role that only has these certain permissions in it, and prevent the user from even trying to access that query to begin with. There might be some ways that you can take care of some of those issues without having to go too hard into a really complicated algorithm to pull it all together.
Well, one tiny thing to add here, permissions is one thing. So you could say, oh, you need to be a logged in user, but then are you allowed to see a record? Are you a viable viewer of that record? And most of the time, only the database can actually tell you that. So you actually need to fetch the data to know he can see that.
So what you're saying is some failures are inevitable. That's a good thing to think about, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Cool. The next question is for Alex. In your demo source code, it had some boilerplate. That's what you say it's a boilerplate. But some of our audiences have found it to be slightly confusing as someone new to Gatsby.js. So the question is like, will we be able to use dgraph as a data source without those boilerplates when the toolkits launch, or do you have to write these boilerplates for every GraphQL source that I'm going to use?
Yeah, so the good thing about that source toolkit is the boilerplate that's there is probably around 100 lines of code. Don't quote me on that, but it's my guess from what I've used it's about that. That's down from probably anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands of lines without a toolkit like that, and rewriting a lot of loops and other things that you would have had in custom schema design and stuff on the Gatsby side. So all that's been eliminated. It doesn't mean all of it has, but I was able to get that demo working at a basic level within a couple hours based on the examples that Vlad and team have put together. So that's a huge step forward. Then once they are able to release the toolkit, the next thing is turning, I believe on their plan, is to look again at the source GraphQL plugin for Gatsby and look to see if we can use toolkit either to update that, or we might just leave that plugin as it is and create a new source plugin that if functions similar, so there's, again, not all this, we can eliminate all of the that boilerplate code and just throw in a GraphQL endpoint and maybe some basic configuration, and you're off to the races. So.
Yep. Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, so minimal change of code is required. Okay, gotcha. The next question is for Andrea. Is there any scenario where you will not choose GraphQL as an API format?
That's a really good question. I can't think of one. I've been really loving my experience with GraphQL so far. It may not be the right solution for everything. So I guess that kind of depends on what you're doing with your project. For me, I really don't want to go back to using REST. I've really been enjoying my experience with GraphQL. It's made development a lot easier, and our users are very happy, so probably not so far, but you never know. We really like thinking in graphs. We have a graph-based product, so I don't think going back to linear thinking would be something that we would do at Grapple, because it's the basis of our product to think in graphs.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, when you said that you can think of a text structurally, that as a mathematician, that was very, very pleasing.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And if your data just isn't related, maybe not using GraphQL, but it's hard to imagine data that doesn't have relationships. So it's really cool to think in graphs. And it's been really helpful for our users and for our product. So I would encourage everyone to use GraphQL because it makes you have a much more powerful relationship with your data, and it's easier to understand.
Okay. Fair. Right. The next.
I have a good example of that if you want me to jump in.
Do jump in.
Yeah. So I think my general response to that would be is it depends on kind of the complexity of your data. If we're talking about anything that's going to require a large database, and there's a lot of relationships going on there, that's fine. But if there's a lot of standalone data, so like the perfect example of this from the front end world is like a web form, a contact form. There's no relationships there, it's just a couple fields. And so for me, it's way easier to create a quick function that's as part of a REST API that accepts that form data than it is to throw together a whole GraphQL server to not build relationships. So
yeah. Okay, anyone else?
I have another, sorry.
Yeah. Go on. Jens, go
I
on.
wanted to say, to add another example. So let's say you have something like an AWS console where you configure like planet scale applications and you fill out like, I don't know, 10 sites of forms, and you just want to dump that struct and then load it again to the front end. Would you actually want to take like all those configurations and then try to get them into a graphical input? That's crazy. You really don't want to do that. So if you have like those kind of use cases where you build dashboards that just dump something and then show it again, there's really no need for something like GraphQL.
Makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. Anyone else? When not to use GraphQL?
OpenID connect callbacks.
All right. So the next question is for Robert. So do you have to do some practices to keep the server and client types in sync? Like if you ensure that a new field is deployed to the server and before the clients go live, and what sort of testing can you do around these sorts of changes?
Yeah. That's a hard question because there's many different things you could do. And I think what you should do depends on the scale that you're operating at. So I'm going to assume that we're talking about a pretty large scale GraphQL endpoint, pretty complicated schema, and we're dealing with native applications like we discussed earlier, where every version out there is going to live indefinitely, whether you like it or not. So if that's the case, then the first thing to realize is that you have to design with backward compatibility in mind. You have to do that. The notion that you can just kind of deploy and you can flip a version back and forth, maybe you can get away with that if you don't have any mobile applications. If you're a pure web app, in many ways, we're, as web developers, we are entirely spoiled because the application via caching can basically just be completely refreshed on demand, and we can blow away any sort of old incompatible API protocols that the client expects to use. But you can't do that with native applications. You can't do that with iOS, Android, or even to some extent Windows native applications. So if that's the case, then yeah, you need to be really careful. The first thing you can do is just design the schema to not be backward compatibility breaking. And you can do that. You know that there are many things that you can do in GraphQL that are not destructive like that. So you can, instead of modifying an existing field, you can just specify a different query. And now obviously that can get ugly. Your schema can bloat out and reduce the signal to noise ratio of reading the schema. It's a trade-off that you'll have to make at some point, that the schema will no longer be, it won't fit into a single screen and you can read it and make sense of it. You'll have to go through and find parts that you need. The other technique is that you can definitely use some of the affordances in your GraphQL toolchain. So you can use deprecation warnings as for, if you have hundreds of client developers, let's say, and when they perform schema sync, you want to tell them to migrate off of a certain field because you're choosing to deprecate it for performance reasons. It's a very good reason to stop using a field. And the difference of making sure that the head version of your Android application is not calling that field versus getting rid of it forever is totally different, right? And then finally, I alluded to another missing piece earlier when we were discussing persistent queries, but persistent queries can go a long way to telling you when it is actually safe to deprecate a field. And there are a handful of cases where you may be lucky enough to push an API breaking change that happens to break nobody or breaks one person. And in all those cases, I mean, this is why it's so important to kind of have a whole picture of how you're going to deal with these things as soon as possible, because if the client application could say something like, hey, we detected an API error. We don't know what happened, but try updating the application through the App Store or something like that, right? That goes a long way to making sure that even if you do end up introducing an API breaking change, that it is it is not as frustrating as it could be to the end user. The user doesn't feel like it's their fault or that they did something wrong. So I know that that answer was all over the place because
no, you actually brought up something interesting, and it reminded me that protobufs are designed to be backward and forward compatible. Is there some way you can link up protobufs with schemas?
There's certainly projects out there that I believe stitch together protobufs and GraphQL because they do have a lot of overlap in the sense that they both generate bindings that you can use as a type system that spans the client and the server. I think there's just kind of there seems to be a leaning where protobufs is more for service-to-service communication. I don't see protobufs used as often between client-server communication across the internet. Yeah. Although I have seen it, and it's pretty interesting. But definitely, a really interesting piece of technology.
Actually,
Right, so
you kind of got words out of my mouth because that's exactly what I was thinking as Robert was explaining some of the backward compatibility issues is protobuf. Like at Google, we saw the exact same issues, and protobuf was sort of designed to solve for them. So I think a follow-up question there, and hopefully I didn't cut you off, Chu. A follow-up question there, Robert, is that so protobuf actually has like a bunch of these systems in place so that once you're there's best practices. Once you assign a number to a field, you never reuse that number. The number is you're supposed to create a new number so that all the previous data stays. Can still be read. Are there things that you think GraphQL spec should enforce to avoid sort of backward incompatible changes, or is something more of like there's a list of best practices that people should do, but whether they choose to do them or not, that's up to the users?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting distinction. Nothing prevents you from going and making a backward compatibility breaking change to your GraphQL schema at the specification layer, or even at the framework layer, right? I mean, whether you're using GraphQL Java or GraphQL.NET Server, you can just go and change the annotations to switch the type of a field that would break all existing clients, or make a nullable field non-nullable, for example. And so the best practices, I think, are don't do that if you can avoid it. But there's nothing else in GraphQL that is that doesn't prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. But I do want to. One of the really interesting things about GraphQL is like the reason why it ends up missing all of these affordances, and people look at it, you're like, okay, well, why is it just this one thing? And a lot of people seem to have brought this up. I think Manesh, you and I were talking about this at GraphQL Asia. Seems like forever ago, doesn't it? But it was still this year. But
this year is a hard year.
Yeah, it's a hard year. But the reason is because the boundaries around what we know of as open source GraphQL are really arbitrary. If you rewind back to before GraphQL was open sourced, there was no clear line of this is where GraphQL starts and this is where GraphQL ends. There was just this sprawling set of tools and protocols and practices at Facebook. And it was really a dedicated effort from Lee and from Dan and from Nick to say, no, GraphQL stops here and here, and this is what we're open sourcing, and then we're specifying it as a separate document. But actually, there could be alternate histories where you don't draw the lines where they drew them, right? You could imagine that. I mean, and this is why when you look at client-side state management libraries like Relay, and Relay has corresponding libraries on iOS and Android that were never open sourced. But the idea that GraphQL would ever be its own thing, just floating out in the middle of nowhere with no solutions up and down the stack, it was never the case. That's why when you look at GraphQL, you end up with all of these integration problems. You're like, okay, where's data loader? Where's caching? How does it talk to this database? How does it construct efficient queries? How do you do persistent queries? How do you do client-side state management? There's just this buffet of problems because these were not real problems. Like Facebook can't work with these problems, right? It had solutions for all of them. It's just that the history is that there was an arbitrary line drawn. I shouldn't say arbitrary. I don't mean that in a bad way at all, right? The line had to be drawn somewhere. You can't just open source the entire stack. But the line was drawn somewhere to say this is GraphQL. And this is what gets open sourced. And that leaves, by definition, all the things above and below the lines. So you end up with this system where you're asking questions like, what about custom scalars? What about performance? What about caching? What about, like subscriptions and all these things? So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but hopefully it's an interesting one.
I think it makes a lot of sense because essentially like what Facebook released was a spec, right? And how it gets implemented was really up to the various implementers of the spec. And so they actually had to go and solve those, like, I would say infrastructure problems about, hey, do we put the caching there or not? How do we execute these queries? Do we iterate upon the results or do we try to do them in a batched way? Like all that stuff was really something that Facebook must have solved internally, but then they'll have to give a system out to the users, and then it would not be a spec that they release, then it would have to be like a GraphQL system that they release, which is a very different kind of a release, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, it also creates these very interesting misconceptions based on the use cases. Like one that I'm sure almost everybody here has heard of is this notion of caching in GraphQL, right? Like GraphQL breaks HTTP caches, breaks CDNs. And it's like, okay, well, let's think about that for a second. If that were a problem at Facebook scale, how could it have worked? And so the answer is simply that the data that comes back from the social graph of like, who are your friends, what events, where do they check in, that shouldn't be cached anyway. And I mean, asterisk, right? There's obviously like many different things that you can mean by caching. I'm talking about caching en route to the client, right? Where you really want that data to be as live as possible. But then people are like, okay, well, if I'm approaching this from a REST mentality, where I did have these static resources that did take advantage of a CDN, and I want that same benefit moving over from REST to GraphQL. Now you can see where there's kind of a disconnect. But again, I think that's all attributed to this kind of like this action of saying like, here's this really mature stack, this really comprehensive stack with solutions to all of these problems, and you take a piece, you're like taking a Jenga block out, and you're like, well, where's the rest of the thing?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we have to wrap up quite soon for time. One more question for Manish, and then one more quick fire question for everyone, and we'll close off. So Manish, when will native JavaScript, which is currently in /, when will it be available in dgraph?
That's a tricky one because so we were hoping initially to dgraph is written in Go, and we were hoping that we would be able to call JavaScript from Go, and we looked at a couple of JavaScript sort of executors, but turns out they are quite limited in what they can do. So there's actually an open RFC at discourse.io, our forum, where we were discussing exactly what the best way would be. And I think from what I understand, the best solution that we have found so far is in /GraphQL, we're going to spin up a Node.js server, put the JavaScript code there, and have dgraph call that. So I think if that's the way that we end up sort of going, then it would probably never be in dgraph. It would just be something specific to /GraphQL, and you would probably still have to like run your Node.js server. And then I think before going to JavaScript, we were like, hey, can we just like run this in Go? Or can we run this in some other language? Something which is probably easier to call from Go. But Go has to be compiled. You have to create a plugin. It becomes tricky, and I think parsing JSON with Go is also not easy. It's a lot of like map interfaces and very kind of complicated. If you
use structs.
Yeah, you need to use, the thing is you need to predefine all of the, so I think we are sitting as a vendor, right? We cannot assume anything about users' data because each of them have their own data. So either we need to generate based upon the schema a Go code for them that we can use to like parse their data types or not. And that becomes tricky as well, because then you're doing compilation every time schema changes. But the whole promise of this thing is that you one-click deploy, right? Like it just works. So it becomes different when you do not control the infrastructure. And I think like in a way, it's the same problem with persistent queries as well. As well as that, if you control the infrastructure, then you can say that okay, all the queries must be persisted upfront. But if you have users who are a 3-person startup somewhere and they're like persistent queries, I don't even know what I'm going to run tomorrow. So it might just change like tonight. We can't expect those things. So it becomes very different when you are running on somebody's laptop or you're running like 100 node cluster on Amazon. And the software has to work across both of them. So long story short, I think it might never come in dgraph, but it would definitely be on /.
Cool.
Well,
just
one
FYI,
quick question.
I've got a Lisp engine that you can embed Lisp in, but sorry, Jens, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask one quick question to Manish. So when I built my demo, I tried to use /dgraph, or I actually use it. And I found that when I don't use it for a long time, it kind of falls asleep and I need to wake it up first. So the first requests fail. And then at some point after, I don't know, a few seconds, is that intended, or am I doing something wrong?
No, that is intended. That's actually like, I think what happens is that, and this is specific to /GraphQL, what happens is that after a few hours, I think after 4 hours of inactivity or something, it just shuts down the server. And then as you hit again, it would bring it back up and then run the query. It apparently should not fail. So if you're seeing failures, that's unintended. But this is all just to make sure that the costs are, that we don't go bankrupt like running all these Amazon queries.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we do shut down if the instances are not being used.
I see.
Cool. Right. Last question, which is a fun question for everyone. We'll start with Alex, go Manish, Alex, Sam, Jens, Andrea, and Robert and Yen. Okay.
Hugh,
Sorry?
Just before you ask question, actually, I had a question for folks as well. I know that we are sort of running slightly out of time. Is it okay if we take a couple more minutes for that question? Okay.
I've got a hard limit at 9 o'clock. So my
okay.
time.
All right. So maybe just a quick question. I think maybe and maybe like Robert, I think you might be the most you might have the most experience for this. Is that what makes GraphQL so successful, right? I mean, we have gRPC, we have protobufs, we have seen like REST JSON, we have seen all kinds of stuff. What is it that GraphQL? Why is it GraphQL? Why is it that we are having a GraphQL conference and not necessarily a REST conference right now?
I think everybody else is probably going to have great answers too. So, Andrea, Alex, you want to take this one?
The first thing I just thought of was what Andrea said earlier. Is like it's more natural for us to think in graphs and in relationships, and that's all these other things. That's kind of unique to GraphQL and graph databases. So. Yeah.
I would actually say it's marketing, because I think the website that describes REST is just not that fancy. The GraphQL.org is better, and then people started talking about that, and someone went to a conference about APIs, maybe they talked about GraphQL, and then the whole thing developed, and now we say, oh, GraphQL is better, but maybe it's just more popular because it's more popular, and because of that, it's getting more popular.
Honestly, I don't think it's more popular, because REST is really it's really widespread. It's everywhere. GraphQL is, I think, in terms of popularity, is probably quite small compared to REST. REST has had a very long history, to be fair.
It depends, because I would actually say most people who use RESTful APIs and not RESTful APIs, they actually don't know that they are doing it. You actively use GraphQL. You know this is a GraphQL query, and you have no clue that you're maybe trying to use RESTful or REST patterns. And I think most people actually don't.
And I guess if you go back to the Roy Fielding's original definition of REST, what we call REST now is not really what he meant either.
Yeah, exactly.
We should have an after-hours party where we debate the definition of REST.
Yeah, I gave up on that.
Would be really fun. You can sell tickets to that, Manish. REST definition debate next conference.
Yeah, next conference, exactly. Yeah, and that would be in person, so people can actually fight.
Is that before or after we define what a sandwich is?
Yeah. Yes.
Awesome.
All right. So last question. This is going to be a fun question, two-part question. Favorite GraphQL editor, Postman, Insomnia, that sort of things. And the second question is, if you're an astronaut in space, what would your favorite part be in space? Alex starts.
GraphQL editor, like graphical? I mean, that's what I generally use in Gatsby world, but
yeah.
And then
basically GraphQL client of choice.
Okay. Oh, client, Gatsby. Anyway, and then space. I don't know. The views would be great.
The views.
That would be definitely worth it.
Right. And Manish?
I use graphical as well. I think I just love the way you can just pick and just create the queries. I think the first time I saw it, I was just like mind blown. I do think it could use support for subscriptions. So in fact, in today's demo as well, I had to switch to using GraphQL Playground and had to hand type my query, which is so rudimentary, right? So yeah, I think support for subscriptions there would be great. My favorite thing in space, to land on some planet actually, or something like being on Mars, or well, Moon is not a planet, but just being on a foreign object like a moon or something.
Okay, Sam.
So yeah, I tend to just use the graphical and GraphQL Explorer and things like that. I do like Insomnia. I don't use it that often. And then I think the coolest thing to be in space would be like if you could be over the rings of Saturn and like swim through the rocks of the rings of Saturn. I think that would be pretty awesome.
They did a documentary in Attack of the Clones, Star Wars Episode 2.
That would be so cool.
Jens? Favorite client?
Yeah, favorite IDE. just graphical and then generate all the rest. And in space, I think I would enjoy the silence because I can just deeply focus on something, but then I don't want to be like too isolated, so maybe not for too long.
That's a very German response. Andrea.
So for the editor, I'm going to stick with everyone else and go with graphical. I love writing queries that look like JSON because it's really familiar and it gives clients a lot of power. And so I think that's also one of the reasons why it's so popular, is because the developer experience is really, really wonderful with GraphQL. And that's probably why we're having this conference today. As far as space, I think the coolest thing would be to see my planet from a different perspective, because sometimes when we're down here, we think things are such a big issue, but when you see it from, like Scott Kelly was talking about, when you see the world just as it is, we are very small, and it makes whatever we think is so big down here a lot less important.
Robert?
Yeah. Favorite GraphQL editor? I'm using conjunction of GraphQL Playground and the VS Code GraphQL extension from Prisma. So.
Here we have someone who's contrarian. Okay, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, and it's just they're all fine. I mean, all the tools that I've used I haven't played with the Postman GraphQL feature. I know that they launched that recently, and that seems pretty interesting because I use Postman for a lot of other things. That may be worth looking into. And then favorite thing about being in space, was that the second part?
Yep.
Oh, I think it'd be really cool to just experience 0G.
Cool. Yeah. And Yan, last but not least.
All of my GraphQL endpoints are protected by Cognito, so I kind of just use Appsync console because that gives me nice integration with Cognito. Otherwise, I'm gonna have a hard time just getting my auth token. Favorite thing space, I guess 0G for me as well, because it's something I've never experienced.
Yeah, and we should connect offline. You can grab the auth token out of the HTTP header and stick it into.
Yeah, but it's just a bit more work. Just easier to just use the console because it's all integrated. They've done a lot more work recently on the console experience as well, so that I don't have to remember the app, the client ID and all of that. It's just all in the drop down.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, less of a hassle that way for sure.
Yeah.
All right. That was fun. Thank you, folks. And to audiences at home, that was GraphQL in space. Please do remember to check out our Discuss page. Some of the speakers have already answered your questions, and I'm quite sure you speakers would also spend some time answering questions there. And thank you. And we'll meet again, this time in hyperspace.